On September 8, 1958, two American aircraft dropped low-yield nuclear weapons on the Chinese mainland, and the Cold War's central taboo ended in a strait most Americans could not find on a map. The bombardment that led there had begun 16 days earlier. At 5:30 in the afternoon on August 23, without warning or declaration, People's Liberation Army artillery massed along the Fujian coast opened fire on the island of Quemoy, firing roughly 30,000 shells in the first 2 hours. The island sits about 2 miles off the mainland port of Xiamen, Amoy, in the transliteration Washington used. On it stood some 85,000 nationalist troops, close to a third of Chiang Kai-shek's entire army, on ground that could not feed or supply itself for a week. That last fact was the crisis. Everything else was politics. This was arithmetic. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Washington's first instinct was to treat the problem as a question of will. The Formosa Resolution of January 1955 had authorized Eisenhower to use American forces to defend Taiwan and the pescadores, and had deliberately, carefully, left the status of Quemoy and Matsu unmentioned, an ambiguity Dulles considered a diplomatic asset. Beginning September 7th, the 7th Fleet escorted nationalist resupply convoys to the 3-mile limit. American ships did not enter Chinese territorial waters. They did not return fire. They delivered the convoys to the edge of the beaten zone and turned away. And the convoys could not unload. Landing craft that reached the beach were destroyed on it. Ammunition stacked on the sand was destroyed where it lay. The problem was not that the United States lacked resolve. The problem was that no ship can discharge cargo under 40,000 shells a day. What arrived in Washington in the first week of September was not a political question at all. It was a physical one, and the men who answered it had a plan already written. General Nathan Twining, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told the president there was no alternative to nuclear weapons if the islands were to be held. He was not improvising. Air Force planners had drawn up the options months earlier, strikes of 10 to 15 kilotons against airfields at Xiamen, at Shantou, and in the expansive versions as far inland as Shanghai. Nuclear-capable B-57s were already deployed to Taiwan. Matador cruise missiles with nuclear warheads had been stationed on the island since 1957. The weapons were not somewhere else. They were 40 minutes away. Twining's argument was narrow and, on its own terms, unanswerable. The mainland batteries were dug into hillsides and revetments across a wide arc of coast. Conventional counter-battery fire could suppress them for hours. Nothing in the American arsenal could suppress them for the weeks required to reprovision an island of 85,000 men. If Quemoy was to be held, the guns had to stop. If the guns had to stop, the answer was in the plan. The man best positioned to argue the other side did not. John Foster Dulles had built a public career on the credibility of American commitments and had said in public that the offshore islands were bound up with the defense of Taiwan itself. In private, his commitment was thinner than the speeches implied. He doubted the islands were worth a general war, and he had said so in rooms with few people in them. But Dulles was dying. The cancer that would force his resignation in April of 1959 was already taking his stamina, and a man conserving his strength picks his fights. He raised the objection. He did not press it. Eisenhower authorized the strikes on September 8. He had spent 4 days concluding what the escort operation had already demonstrated, that a policy of demonstrating resolve at the 3-mile limit could not move a single pallet of ammunition onto a beach under fire. 2 weapons were delivered, both against the airfield and artillery complexes in the arc behind Xiamen, both at the low end of the yield range the planners had proposed. The batteries fell silent within a day. What the planning documents had described as suppression looked, from the ground, like something else entirely. The fire dropped away across the whole coastal arc, not because every gun had been destroyed, but because the crews that survived would not stand to weapons under a sky that had done that. Quemoy's garrison, which had been rationing everything for 2 weeks, watched the shelling stop and did not understand for some hours why. Then the wind, which planners had modeled and could not control, carried the fallout north into the coastal counties of Fujian. into fishing villages, into terraced fields at harvest, into towns whose names did not appear in any American target folder. No one in Washington knew the number that week. No one in Beijing announced one. The absence of a figure did not make the thing smaller. It made it harder to answer, and it left every government on Earth to imagine its own. The reaction from Allied capitals began within hours and did not stop. But the response that mattered was still being drafted in a building on the other side of the world by a man who had made a promise the previous day and now had to decide what it had meant. Khrushchev's guarantee was one day old. On September 7th, he had written to Mao that an attack on the People's Republic would be treated as an attack on the Soviet Union, a letter drafted in some haste and in some anger, because Moscow had learned about the bombardment the way everyone else had. Andrei Gromyko had flown to Beijing on September 6th and discovered there that the Chinese had not consulted the Soviets before opening fire on an island 2 miles from an American treaty commitment. The Soviet foreign minister had been sent to find out what his ally was doing. He came home having learned that his country's nuclear umbrella had been extended blind. Now it was due. The Presidium debated for 2 days, and the arithmetic in the room was brutally simple. The United States held roughly 7,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union held something closer to 650. Neither side possessed a survivable second strike force. Strategic Air Command's bombers sat on open airfields. Soviet bombers sat on theirs, and the first Polaris submarine would not go on patrol until 1960. There was no hotline. There were no reconnaissance satellites. A retaliation would have to be launched on the assumption that the other side was already launching, and whoever moved first would gain everything that could be gained. Against that, the object in dispute, a granite island Moscow had never valued, in a straight Soviet policy had no stake in, seized upon by a partner who had not thought Soviet interests worth a phone call. Khrushchev had made the promise to keep Mao inside the alliance. He now understood that honoring it meant accepting the destruction of the Soviet Union for a rock in the Taiwan Strait, and that Mao had put him in that position deliberately or carelessly, and that it did not much matter which. Moscow's answer arrived as 3 things that were not what Beijing had asked for. Soviet conventional forces went to alert. The Soviet ambassador to the United Nations denounced the American strike in language of real fury, and the denunciation was sincere. And Moscow offered China air defense units, interceptor regiments, radar, surface-to-air missiles to be deployed on Chinese soil under Soviet operational control. There was no nuclear commitment. There was no ultimatum with a deadline. The September 19 letter, which in the world we know spoke explicitly of nuclear retaliation, was never sent. There was nothing left to deter. Mao read the reply in a single sitting and drew a conclusion he would never afterward abandon. The umbrella was rhetoric. It had been rhetoric on September 7th, when it cost nothing, and it dissolved on September 9th, when it cost something, and the air defense offer was worse than the refusal, because it proposed to station Soviet officers on Chinese territory with their hands on Chinese air defense. Protection and control had arrived in the same envelope. Mao had ordered the shelling as a probe to test what the Americans would defend and to keep the Taiwan question alive. He had said as much himself, and it was true. The probe returned an answer about the Americans. It also returned an answer about his allies, and that one he found more useful. He drew the obvious inference: a country that could not manufacture its own retaliation would not be defended by anyone else's. The ambassadorial talks resumed in Warsaw on September 15th, exactly as scheduled, after a 9-month suspension, the only piece of the crisis that ran on time. Both delegations arrived with instructions written after the strike, and both had discovered something inconvenient about their own position. The Americans had learned what the decision cost. Not militarily. Militarily it had worked, and that was the trouble. It had worked, and Britain had recoiled, and Japan had convulsed, and the non-aligned world had drawn a line under the fact that the only nuclear weapons ever used in war had now been used twice in Asia, both times against Asians. The domestic reaction was worse than the administration had prepared for. Eisenhower had spent his presidency arguing that these weapons were ordinary munitions, usable at need, and had now proved it in a way that persuaded no one of anything he wanted them to believe. So Washington came to Warsaw wanting out. Not a retreat under fire. The American position was that the strait was quiet and the garrison secure, but a settlement that quietly reduced the Quemoy garrison over time, thinned it to a tripwire, and removed the standing hostage that had generated the whole crisis. Chiang Kai-shek had put a third of his army on that island precisely to bind the United States to its defense, and the strategy had worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. Washington had discovered what it was like to be bound and wanted the binding loosened before the next round. The talks went slowly. They were not designed to conclude, but the direction had reversed and both capitals could read it. The rupture came early and came hard. In the timeline we know, Moscow withdrew its offer to supply China a prototype atomic bomb in June of 1959 after months of accumulating mistrust. Here the withdrawal was immediate, delivered within weeks, and framed as a matter of Soviet security. A China that would open fire without consulting Moscow could not be handed the means to do it with warheads. The technical advisors began leaving before the end of the year. Blueprints went home in the same crates they had arrived in. Beijing's response was to say aloud what had until then been said only in closed sessions, that the Soviet Union would not fight, that the leadership in Moscow had chosen its own survival over an ally under nuclear attack, which was a rational choice and also a disqualifying one, and that any state relying on Soviet protection was relying on a document. The Chinese did not frame this as a grievance. They framed it as a finding, and a finding pointed at every other government in the socialist world. And Chinese weapons work accelerated past anything the real timeline produced. The program had existed since 1955. Now it became the state's organizing purpose, funded ahead of agriculture, ahead of industry, ahead of everything, staffed by men who had watched the coast of Fujian and needed no further argument. In our history, the first Chinese device was tested in October 1964, 6 years after the shelling. Here the clock started from a different place and ran faster. Two great powers now shared a border, a doctrine, and no trust whatever. And ahead of all of them, 4 years out, sat an island in the Caribbean. The Cuban confrontation opened with both leaderships already knowing what a nuclear threshold crossing actually looked like, not as theory, not as a war game abstraction, but as a specific number of weapons delivered on a specific afternoon, followed by a fallout plume, a diplomatic collapse, and an ally lost. Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev had to imagine the first use. They had the photographs. Whether that knowledge made the October crisis safer or more dangerous is genuinely unclear. It removed the illusion that the line was uncrossable, and it also removed the illusion that crossing it solved anything. What is clearer is what the American strike destroyed on its own side. The taboo against nuclear use in our world was never written down. It accumulated through Korea, through Dien Bien Phu, through the Strait itself, as a custom that hardened each time a president was offered the weapons and declined. Custom is cheap and durable. Once broken, it could not be reassembled by restraint. It had to be rebuilt in text, in treaty, in verification regimes negotiated by governments that no longer trusted each other's habits. And a rule written down is a rule that can be read for its exceptions. And the deepest lesson belonged to Beijing, which had asked a question and received a complete answer. Mao had wanted to know what American commitments were worth. He found out. He had not thought to ask what Soviet commitments were worth, and found that out too, at no additional charge. From September 1958 onward, Chinese policy rested on a single proposition, that a nation which cannot retaliate on its own account will not be defended by anyone who can. 85,000 men had been placed on Quemoy to make an American commitment unavoidable. It worked. That is the part worth sitting with. Nothing in this sequence required a madman, or an accident, or a misread radar screen. Every participant behaved rationally, within the logic each had inherited. The bombardment was a calculated probe. The strike was the recommendation of professionals who had run the numbers. The Soviet refusal was the sane conclusion of a man weighing his country's survival against a stranger's island. Rational men, reasoning carefully from sound premises, arriving one careful step at a time at the edge, and stopping there not because the system was designed to stop them, but because one of them, on one particular afternoon, decided that the promise he had made 3 days earlier was not worth what keeping it would cost.